Okay, so last week we took a look at the Declaration of Independence, and I showed you in the Declaration of Independence where you see God listed 4 times. We went through this idea of, and I was grateful for my brothers here who gave chapter and verse of Isaiah 33:22, where God is our king, our lawgiver, and our judge. You have executive, legislative, judicial branch. All of those are found in the Declaration of Independence. And as we went through this idea of Jerusalem and Athens with this idea of a representative form of government, we covered all of that last week. And one of the things that we often find, especially today in America, is this push for a separation of church and state, although in our founding documents there's really nothing listed, and a lot of them will quote what they call the letter of Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist Convention, where he talks about an invisible wall of separation, but in context it's the exact opposite. And as we saw in our study last week, that all of these different colonies were established for the purpose of religious liberty and freedom, and they came together, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and they came together to fight against England. And we're going to look at kind of 3 crises that founded or at least established what we have today of the United States of America, and they were critical. And the first one, which we covered briefly, was the American Revolution. And you know that England went to war with France in 1763, and then they had to pay for that war after they defeated France. And so for 13 years they increased the taxation on the colonies, finally to the point where they were upset about it. And you saw some of the concerns listed in the Declaration of Independence that were stated by the founders when they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And they called on divine providence for protection as they took on a war with the greatest nation on the face of the earth. And then we would have the Revolutionary War that would begin in 1776, although we did hear the shot fired around the world in 1775, but with the Declaration of Independence signed on July 4, 1776, it goes through this picture of the Revolutionary War. Now, it's not going to be until 1787 that we have the U.S. Constitution, and 1783, and then we go through these ideas when it's ratified, and we're going to see this Constitution that's going to be developed out of the grievances of the Declaration of Independence, where we get the 7 articles of the U.S. Constitution. The amendments would come later, although they would give us the Bill of Rights. The very first Bill of Rights, interestingly enough, as you guys know, the First Amendment is a freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom to peaceably assemble for right of redress of grievances against the government, the freedom of speech. And they listed that because every sovereign, and as we looked at that video, there's just 2 types of government in the sense. You have oligarchies, and then you have a republic. What we have is a constitutional republic. And so with this constitutional republic, they gave us this constitution with the 7 articles, but they understood that the sovereign in America is found in the first 3 words of the preamble, which is, we the people. And every sovereign needs a counselor. There's counselors to the king. The president has all of his cabinet, and they all give him advice. Kings have their counselors. But in America, our founders understood that the counselor to the king would be in relation to the First Amendment. Freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and again, the freedom to peaceably assemble for right of redress of grievances. The idea is that we had to be an educated people. But what's fascinating is a lot of people struggle today because the first crisis was a Revolutionary War. Then we would go through the Civil War, and that had to do primarily with slavery. Some folks will say it was states' rights. Every single declaration of war by the southern states included this idea of slavery. So whatever revisionist history you're reading, I'm in complete disagreement. It had to do with slavery. It had to do with the ability to own another human being. And you're going to find that Washington and Jefferson were both slaveholders. We're going to see that tonight. But what's fascinating is especially in today's day and age, this was established by old white guys. They were hypocrites. They were slaveholders. The Declaration of Independence was only written for white people. But as we studied previously, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary, it was written for any people at any time. And we're also going to find that though they did hold slaves, they were in opposition to slavery. And I'll read some direct writings from Jefferson himself tonight. They were in opposition to slavery, and they were accountable, and they really felt as though they needed to abolish slavery. We're going to talk about the 3/5 compromise, and we'll go into that in later weeks. But were they hypocrites? And here they are invoking God in their Declaration of Independence while at the same time holding other human beings as slaves. And you look at that and you think, that is hypocritical. How in the world can they talk about freedom and make a declaration of freedom and invoke God and still hold slaves? And so I think tonight what we're going to take a look at is these three crises, and we're also going to see what this masterpiece, this artwork is of the United States of America. We'll cover that. I love the Aristotle idea of four causes, and we'll cover that momentarily. But I want to start with, why is God written into the Constitution in four different areas, and why would they invoke God and still be men who held slaves? They're just like you, interestingly enough. They're feeble, and they have their issues. Can you imagine 233 years from now, 243 years from now, they evaluate us by the way we treat human life in the womb. What did you do? Did you participate? Were you silent? And they'll evaluate the generation, and then you're going to have revisionist historians, and they're going to write you out. Well, they had slavery, and slavery was commonplace in their culture. And yet they came to the United States with this idea of civil government, which was established, as we saw, through the Geneva Bible, and this concept of a representative form of government, appoint godly men who are not covetous over thousands, hundreds, fifties, tens. You come in with this concept with Aristotle and the Republic, and they put this together, and then you have the Protestant Reformation, and they write this civil government, and you have the Mayflower Compact, and all these things start to take place. And they make a direct approach to abolish slavery. But why would God be in all of this? And what's the point of putting God in the Declaration of Independence? So here we have from last week the four areas in the Declaration of Independence where God is listed: laws of nature and nature's God. Important, we'll cover it momentarily, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, appealing to the supreme judge of the world, and protection of divine providence. And there you can also see this idea of laws of nature. That would be the legislature, supreme judge of the world. That would be the judicial. Divine providence would be the executive power, and creator would be this idea of what the founders were putting together, and they recognized it. Now, what happens is they are breaking away from bondage. They feel themselves in bondage to the taxation that was invoked upon them because of the war with France that Britain had gone through, the British Empire. And for 13 years, they're enduring this. They had experienced a taste of freedom. Religious liberty was on the rise as a number of the colonies had been founded for the purpose of religious freedom. We didn't go over a lot of that, but suffice it to say that's the case. And as we took a look at even the ministers who established the Declaration of Independence and this concept of the laws of nature and nature's God, as we took a look at previous pastors, and this idea of what God desires, and this is where Dallas Willard talks about the disappearance of moral knowledge in his magnum opus, the last book he wrote. And this disappearance of moral knowledge is the breakdown of culture. And as I'd shared with you in the previous time, I was meeting with an agnostic / possible atheist and decrying the decline of California and moving out of the state, and having been involved and being very communal minded, and now moving out of the state because he doesn't want to live here anymore. It wasn't like it was when he was young. And I said, what's missing? And listing all of these ideals that are moral in their standards. And I said, is it wrong to steal? Is it wrong to lie? And a couple of the folks around the table, 4 of them not being men of faith, 3 being men of faith, and as we had these conversations, I said, is there anything such as an absolute moral? Are there absolutes? We're governed by the law, absolute laws, law of gravity and law of thermodynamics. Are there moral absolutes? And their declaration is no. And I said, then how do you know that stealing is wrong? Says who? Because here our founders are invoking God, that his authority supersedes that of man's. Where did they get these concepts? How did they come together? Now they're being enslaved. What gives them the right to consider that they have inalienable rights endowed by their Creator that gives them the right to fight against a sovereign king, an oligarchy, a monarchy? What gives them that right? And they declare God does. They declare God does. And that's an act of faith. And through the scriptures, they understand that if you abide by these moral principles, your land will flourish. The scripture says that righteousness exalts a nation, sin is a reproach to any people. And you look at this, a nation that represents in the totality of the world's population throughout all of history, represents less than 3% of the world's population, yet we've had more patents, more Nobel Peace Prize winners, more symphonies, the greatest accumulation of wealth in the history of the world, and the greatest empire, in a sense, ever established. I hate to use the word empire, but the greatest nation ever established on the face of the earth. Were we blessed? Was it something different? Was it the resources? Well, South America has more natural resources than North America does. And if it's the resources and the people, then North Korea doesn't make any sense along with South Korea, because after the Korean War, when the parallel line was established, North Korea got all the arable land. And all you have to do is take a picture of the Korean peninsula at night. North Korea is completely black, and South Korea is lit up with commerce. The South represents the 11th largest GDP on the face of the earth, and in the North, their people are eating grass trying to survive. And what's the difference between the two? Same people, same language, and actually, North Korea got more farmable land than South Korea did. Why is one succeeding and the other isn't? It's one word: freedom. Whether you're an atheist, an agnostic, whether you're Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, whether you're Reformed, Conservative, Orthodox, it's irrelevant. We all have within our heart a desire for liberty and freedom. There's no one in this room that's going to submit themselves to being my slave. And as I said last week, if you do want to do that, come and clean my house. We'll get working. We long for freedom, and our heart's cry is for freedom. We'll tolerate a lot. And we'll give up our freedom for the sake of security, but as Benjamin Franklin said, we deserve neither when we're there. And liberty and freedom are like muscles. If you don't exercise them, you lose them. And so how do you take away liberty and freedom from somebody? You take away God. You take away their identity. You take away their knowledge. And the Bible says that faith comes from hearing, hearing from the Word of God, that you start to read. You have to teach people how to read. One of the very first public school acts was called the Old Satan Deluder Act, and it was in 1600s when they established a public school system in America, and for the sole purpose of teaching the children to read so they couldn't be deluded by the old deluder himself, Satan. And they understood that faith would come from this capacity, and they wanted all their students to be able to read. Educate them. And so we come to this place where God has a huge role, and so does the clergy in the founding of the nation. And folks would disagree with it, but you just look at the original sources, do your own homework, regardless of if you're a person of faith or not. Where do we get these principles from? And the founders saw this idea of a blessing in Deuteronomy 15. It says, "For the Lord will greatly bless you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to possess as an inheritance, only if you carefully obey the voice of the Lord your God to observe with care all these commandments which I command you." You see, this idea is if you follow these rules, they're like laws that we're governed by, law of gravity. It doesn't matter if I believe with all my heart that the law of gravity doesn't exist. If I run off a cliff, I'm going to die. It doesn't matter if I believe I'm going to fly or if I convince myself otherwise, I'm still going to die. I'm bound by that law of gravity, and it doesn't have any bearing on what faith I am. I'm bound by that law. In the same regard, mankind and the understanding of our founders with men of faith, and some maybe being deists, some coming from different denominations, and even a deist back then would make the evangelical world look liberal. And they would consider these things and they'd say, if we honor this and do this, we'll be blessed. And of course, they take on the greatest nation on the face of the earth. They have victory. 1 in 9 Americans fought in the Revolutionary War. And I want to add to that. They signed the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776. They pledged their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor. Pretty amazing. They know they're all going to be hunted. They have the Continental Army, which is ragtag. And after signing that, and really what's interesting is prior to that, Washington was holding off the British in Boston Harbor. He was up on Dorchester Heights. And he had held the high ground, but he didn't have any armament. And he knew that when the winter receded and the snows melted, that the British would make an advance on Dorchester Heights, and he wouldn't be able to hold it any longer. And this ragtag Continental Army would be decimated. He needed artillery. He had none. 24-year-old bookseller, somewhat rotund. He came to Washington. His name was Henry Knox. He was a bookseller from Boston. And he said, I know where you can get artillery. And Washington said, what do you know about artillery? He said, I read a book. He said, what's your plan? He said, Fort Ticonderoga. It was abandoned by the British. It has an enormous amount of artillery. He said, I'm going to need logistics. I'm going to need some financing to get the wagons, the horses, to transport it. One of the greatest feats in engineering that ever occurred up to that point. He took it over Lake Champlain and brought it over the mountains. Didn't lose a single piece of artillery. At certain times it would snow. They'd have to put it on sled-driven carts. Other times it would be open on the road so they could put it on wagon wheel. And they finally got it to Dorchester Heights, and Boston Harbor was completely fog-laden. And as they brought it to Dorchester Heights, on the top of Dorchester Heights where the Continental Army was, it was a beautiful full moon night, no fog. The fog was down in the harbor. So the British didn't even see them assembling it, and they assembled it all in that evening. When the fog lifted, they began bombing Boston Harbor and had an enormous victory, and everyone thought, this is great. And this happened in March. And so with this victory, they go into the Declaration of Independence signing. They sign it. And immediately following the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the American forces lost battle after battle after battle after battle after battle after battle after battle. They're finally holed up on the Manhattan Peninsula. The British are bringing in the largest fleet ever assembled in the history of the world. The only time it's ever been exceeded was D-Day. Pausing for emphasis. They come in with this massive fleet. They're going to obliterate Washington, who is trapped on this peninsula. They conquer all of their ammunition supplies. And Washington evacuates his army in the East River. They put padding on their oars, quietly cross the harbor and evacuate the entirety of the Continental forces in September. The winds hold back the British fleet from just decimating them by bombardment. Washington is able to escape up to Valley Forge and winter there. While they're wintering in December in Valley Forge of 1776, a third of the troops are dying of dysentery. Another third can't even they don't even have boots. They have to wrap their feet in burlap sacks. They're freezing and they're starving. And on December 24th, when most Americans were by hearth and home getting ready for Christmas, Washington passes out a pamphlet written by Thomas Paine, who was actually one of the inspirations of the Revolutionary War. He died penniless. He was kind of not an anarchist, but he wasn't a Christian. He hated the church for the most part. And he went to France to participate in the revolution there. But Thomas Paine writes this thing called The American Crisis, fascinating work. And he wrote, these are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in the season shrink from the duty of their country, but those who defend it now deserve the love and respect. And Washington is moved by it. He has it reprinted and passed out to all the soldiers that can muster. And they have a plan because conscriptions for the Continental Army are going to be up January 1st, and what's left of the Continental Army will be gone. It'll be over. And this experiment in liberty that you've enjoyed for over 240 years will never have existed. He passes this pamphlet out, musters the remaining 2/3 of his forces, and the third that don't have boots march the 11 miles in the worst snowstorm on the eastern seaboard. Many of them said it was like walking through milk, and they didn't walk any faster than a baby could crawl. Some froze to death on the way there. They crossed the Delaware. You've seen those pictures. And they surprised the Hessians on Christmas Day, had a victory, turned the tide of the war. Conscriptions increased. And of course, later, France entered the war. And here we are today because of the victory that was almost lost. And again, only 1 in 9 Americans fought in the Revolutionary War. What inspired them? Why was it so important? It was freedom. It was for liberty. These are priceless. It would be Thomas Paine who would say, that which we receive too easily, we esteem too lightly. Freedom is precious. We need to fight for it. And so they did. And as they started to apply these things, they realized, as Benjamin Franklin said in the Continental Congress, or at the Constitutional Convention, he said, what form of government have you given us? A woman asked him. He said, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. And the idea is they had been deadlocked. They had 13 colonies. Just a few of them represented the largest portion of the population. And yet others of the colonies had sparse population but wanted equal representation. And they said, no, one man, one vote. And they said, no, it's a republic. They said, well, how do we get representation for the states? The larger states should allow more representatives and the smaller states should get less. And they said, no, that's not fair. So for the very first time in history, they were at a deadlock and everyone was going to leave the Constitutional Convention and they were done. And they couldn't come to an agreement, these 13 colonies that had been established with different religions and all these other things, and they had vanquished a foe, but they couldn't find unity together. And Benjamin Franklin, the only signer of all three of the major founding documents, the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Paris Peace Treaty, he stood up, he had gout in his legs, and he was very old at the time, and he said, I propose that we break for 3 days of fasting and prayer. A sparrow doesn't fall from the sky without God's full knowledge. Why would we not inquire of him as to what to do and ask him for wisdom? We're going to be like every other nation that has disappeared unless we call on him. And during the revolution, we called on him fervently, and he delivered us then, he'll deliver us now. And so they adjourned for 3 days of fasting and prayer, and they returned. And when they returned, they established a bicameral legislature. Senate, House. You get to serve for 2 years in the House, 6 years in the Senate. Every state gets 2 senators, and every state, dependent on their population, gets a number of representatives in the lower house. So everyone had equal representation, and they both deliberated together. Fascinating accomplishment. And as they did this, they continued from that day forward to open every session of the legislature in prayer to this day. They understood that. And God blessed the nation. They printed the Revolutionary Bible. They passed that out. It was agreed to by the Continental Congress, and they printed it. One of the very first acts of the Congress. I thought somebody was calling me. But here's what happens. Here's what happens to freedom. And this is what's called the Tytler cycle. And it's a Scottish historian who developed it. And he'd actually gotten it from a number of other sources. But if you see in the upper right-hand section where it says faith, do you see that? Just go to the left of it where it says bondage. So let's begin. The colonies are in bondage to the king. They're overwhelmed by this bondage, and by faith, they realize and they establish this idea of inalienable rights, and they begin to realize and call upon someone greater than themselves. Faith is established, and from the faith comes courage, and then with that courage comes the liberty. And we know the difference between liberty and freedom. Freedom is having choices. Liberty is doing what's right? And you can exercise liberty even in prison. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., when he was in a prison in Birmingham, Alabama, the pastors in the community said, you're on the wrong side of history, you're in prison. He said, no, you're on the wrong side of history because you're not in prison with me. He was exercising. And when Apostle Paul wrote in Galatians, stand fast therefore in the liberty for which Christ has set you free, he was in prison when he wrote that. But when you exercise liberty, you get freedom. And with that freedom comes abundance. We have choices now. I didn't eat I didn't eat the pulled pork because I had dinner earlier. I am full as a tick. I just don't think I can eat another thing. Welcome to America. Where do you want to go tonight? Oh, I don't want to do pizza again. I don't want to go to Chinese. Bollywood, I don't know, Indian food. I feel, I have a little heartburn. I don't think I can do that. It's kind of a hot summer night. Let's do sushi. That's freedom. You have choices. And in addition, you have the ability to pay for it. And they whittle those freedoms away, and you've seen the illustration. If you get $100 in your paycheck and you go to a restaurant where everything on the menu is $100 or less, you have complete freedom to buy anything on that menu. If the government comes in and takes 25% of it, you have 25% less choices, thus you have 25% less freedom. They take 50% of your paycheck, you have 50% less choices, 50% less freedom. And it doesn't matter if it's government or a robber putting a gun to your head and taking $25 from your $100 paycheck. The results are the same. You have less choices, less freedom. But in America, we have abundance. And with this abundance comes selfishness. We no longer tithe. We no longer give to the poor. We're more concerned with our baubles and trinkets and our gifts than we are with the giver of the gifts. We don't share. We don't participate in faith. I don't really need to go to church, football's on. I don't really need to participate and raise my kids in that. Somebody else will educate them. I don't have to go down to City Hall and participate in local government. Somebody else will do that. Somebody else will do that. Somebody else will do that. And all of a sudden, these freedoms that we haven't exercised, our muscles start getting soft. And while you're at home and you're not exercising physically and you're just continuing to enjoy these opportunities for gastronomical delights, you're getting bigger, as you can see with me. And you exercise those freedoms, and then you become selfish. And with that selfishness comes complacency, as you can see in the cycle. And with the complacency comes apathy. I just don't care. I just want to be left alone. I don't want to participate. And honestly, stepping into the public arena and stepping into the public square and participating, last Tuesday night's meeting was awful. It was really rough. And I found out from a number of folks that somebody wrote a really lovely letter about me in the Acorn. Just can't wait to read it. and you're out there, and so you get beat up. You know, it'd be a lot nicer just being on a beach somewhere, you know, not dealing with this. Why do we do it? Why do we engage? Well, it's not for me. I don't know if you guys saw my little grandson running through here, Oliver. These folks had fought for the liberty you're enjoying, especially D-Day when you saw that. And one of the things that touched me Tuesday night is we had Leonard Zerlin, the survivor of D-Day. He was a turret gunner on a B-26 Marauder. I'm with him as I'm giving him a special presentation. We're showing the video. I've got my arm around him, and they talk about, he's watching himself on the video, and he's recounting the fact that what affects him the most, and he's never forgotten about it, in every day of his life for 75 years, all the men who didn't come home, never got to have a family, they never got married, they never had kids. They died that day, liberating a continent. And when that was playing on the video, he was sobbing. And he says, it's so true, I never forget that. Yet for us, it's apathy. We just want to be left alone. And then we become dependent. Oh, I'm not dependent. How many of you saw the final on Game of Thrones? I don't know, maybe this is the wrong audience. There are certain things we can't do without. And we become dependent on it. And that dependency brings bondage. And you know, what starts out as just taking the edge off becomes something we can't do without. And now we see the destruction. And then all of a sudden we look, and all the rights that we gave up because we just wanted security, so we gave away our liberty. We just wanted security, so we gave away our freedom. And now we find that the state owns everything, and we can't live here anymore. Well, someday there's not going to be another state to move to. And that brings us to this bondage again. Well, how does a nation, they say this is a 200-year cycle, and we're past it. How do we survive it? Here's a Tytler cycle in history, just to give you an idea. Bondage, people oppose the conditions. Spiritual faith, searching with some degree of unity for a common cause. Courage, fighting for freedom. Liberty, success, prosperity, blessings. And we read that out of Deuteronomy, remember? But then we have misplaced liberty. We think we have the freedom to do as we please, and there isn't a God. We're not accountable. My body, my choice. And we redefine the rules. It's not a baby, it's a blob of tissue. Whether you agree with me or not, let's talk about that. We have the liberty to deny God, the liberty to abuse grace, to sin, liberty to control ourselves, the liberty to divide the body of Christ. And all of a sudden we just become this chaos. But in the course of this liberty, we're finding abundance. Because as we've applied it, we've experienced this liberty, we have abundance. And that abundance begins to take shape because we've removed this moral prerogative and we've removed God from the equation, or an accountability to a higher source. And we become selfish. It's private interest groups. And we divide by color. If I were magical and I was able to take a wand and go, whoosh, and everybody's the same color, we would divide over the color of our eyes. Did you see the way the green-eyed people looked at me? And so as we went through, we're going to see this Hegelian dialectic where you create a problem, and then the solution to the problem is half as bad as the problem, so people will take it, but the government takes more of it and then creates, and what they're doing is they put us against each other, rich against poor, Christians against Muslims, straights against gays, and we just divide the nation, and then somebody comes in and takes over. This selfishness results in complacency, a sense of entitlement, whining and complaining. You owe me something. And then apathy. We accept no responsibility. We blame everyone else, critical of everything. I'm not angry, I'm Italian. I'm not an alcoholic, I'm Irish. I'm Irish. It was my mom and dad's fault. I have no doubt. I'm sure your mom and dad, if that's what you're saying, were pretty rotten people. But that has no bearing. You don't get to pick the parents you get in this world, but you can pick the kind of parent you're going to be. That's called personal responsibility. We want to blame people. And then with that comes dependence. I don't want to have to deal with the hard things in life, and if you just give me a little something and all I can do is sit in this couch, and we become dependent. Control of independence, freedom is centralized. Okay, the government will give you this, but it won't give you that. Okay, I'm good with that, just as long as you leave me alone. And then it comes to this idea of bondage, a point of degeneration when no systematic change will help, and we're stuck. So how do we avoid this? Because it seems like we're in this cycle, doesn't it? Hello? Yes. How do we avoid it? Well, this is an interesting thought, and this is an engineering term, and I'm not an engineer, but I do understand this. I look at these big giant cranes in the sky, not many in California because we're not building anything, but I saw a lot of them in Texas. It's like the state bird, the crane. And the question at the top is, why don't cranes fall over? Tower cranes are essentially at any major construction site, and so you have the loading arm. It lifts heavy things. You have a loading platform, you have the trolley. But the reason why the crane doesn't tip over is because it has a counterweight. Do you see that up there? And this counterweight, concrete counterweights are fitted to the crane's short arm, and they're needed for lifting heavy loads so that the crane doesn't collapse. So you need a counterweight to keep it protected, otherwise it would fall over. How do we keep a republic from falling over? Here's a picture of the counterweights themselves. What is the counterweight to this Tytler cycle? Well, it brings us back to what the founders declared. It's interesting. It's called the Golden Triangle, and it keeps a society on liberty on the liberty side of the cycle. These three aspects are intertwined in the Golden Triangle: freedom, virtue, and faith. So in the bottom of that curve, it's hard to read, but in the bottom you see the red, that's bondage. Bondage, then comes spiritual faith, then courage, then strength, then liberty, then abundance. When we get to abundance, how do we avoid getting into apathy? Then dependency. How do we avoid getting on the backside of that cycle and keeping a republic safe? Well, here's the Golden Triangle described. And this is Os Guinness who put this together from a number of writings, and it's fascinating. And he did it as he observed our founders. Virtue requires faith. Faith requires freedom. Freedom requires virtue. You see how they're intertwined? Why did our founders give us the First Amendment? Because if you're going to have virtue, you need to be accountable to God, and you need to be able to freely seek Him. Yeah, but I believe in adult baptism and not this silly infant baptism. Okay, then you can be an Anabaptist and you can be a Presbyterian. Good. You can live in that colony and you can whatever. Freedom. But the religious freedom cannot come in conflict with the U.S. Constitution. Thus, Sharia law is in direct conflict with the Constitution. I can't take the rights in the Constitution to override your own. But for a republic to survive, as John Adams said, only a moral people can govern a republic. It requires faith, freedom, and virtue. Faith, accountable to a God bigger than yourself with absolutes that we must all agree that stealing is wrong, coveting is wrong, lying is wrong, adultery is wrong, okay? We must agree that we're accountable to God and we have to do right by Him and do right by each other. Remember the Jews, 3 to 5 million coming out of slavery in Egypt, and they lived there 40 years in the wilderness without a standing army or police force because they had the downloaded moral app. And that returns to a culture, and we must teach that. And that faith comes there, but we're going to get freedom with that faith. But with that freedom, we also have to apply virtue. God didn't give you an increase in your paycheck so you could buy more junk. He didn't make a culture so that you can buy more things to impress people you don't know with money you don't have. He didn't allow this so that you can incur debt and be a slave to the borrower, or to the lender, excuse me. Have no debt but to love. Be generous. These are all virtues that must be applied. Otherwise, you just fall in love with the things instead of the God who, you fall in love with the gifts instead of the giver of the gifts. Takes us back to Deuteronomy. You say, okay, I see this golden triangle. I see what our founders intended. I see why they called upon a larger God. But again, I'm not so sure these folks were hypocrites. And did they really believe in this golden triangle? This is George Washington's farewell address, September 19, 1796. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain, yes, good. In vain, would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars? Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. 'Tis substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. Can it be that Providence has not connected the permanent felicity, happiness of a nation with its virtue? That's the founder. They understood these things go hand in hand. If the nation's going to prosper, the people have to be virtuous. If they're virtuous, they're going to have freedom. If they have freedom, they have to have faith. If they have faith, they're going to have virtue and continue to apply these things. Yeah, but I don't like to go to church. It's filled with hypocrites. There's room for more. A hypocrite isn't someone who sets a standard and fails to achieve it. A hypocrite is someone who knows the truth and keeps people deliberately away from it for the sake of personal gain. Massachusetts Governor Samuel Adams wrote in February 12, 1779, he said, while the people are virtuous, they cannot be subdued. But once they lose their virtue, they will be ready to surrender their liberties to the first external or internal invader. If we would enjoy this gift of heaven, let us become a virtuous people. There's no person that wakes up and says, you know, today's the day I'm going to ruin my family by committing adultery. It starts with subtlety. There's no mother who holds her baby and says, I can't wait for you to grow up to be a crack addict. But the subtlety of the breakdown of culture and the destruction of the family unit and the identity of how we're designed and how we're to operate, and some of you, even as I state these things, are in conflict with that. I get that. This is the day and age. But regardless of how you feel about religion and the church, the one thing we can all agree on is it's getting pretty bad out there. Do you have a better answer? Maybe you do. We can talk later. I'm all interested. The three crises of America, interestingly enough, I touched on them earlier. The Revolutionary War, which we saw, and then we had the Civil War, which happened as a result of slavery. And one war that we're in currently is this idea of progressivism. And this has been ongoing for a number of years. And what's happened with this idea is human beings are evolving is now the new format. We've thrown off the constraints of religion. We don't need God. It's one of my favorite jokes I usually tell about the three scientists who went to God and said, we no longer need you. We figured out the genome of man, and they actually told the junior scientist that he had to go and do it. So he goes and tells God, I was with the other two guys, and we just want to let you know we don't need you anymore. We figured out the genome of man, and we can make man out of dirt, just like you. God's like, really? He's like, yeah. Science, we're bigger than you now. He goes, okay. God says, fine. Tomorrow we'll have a contest. You'll make a man, I'll make a man. And they said, fine. And so they gather that day, and the scientists are there, and God says, okay, you guys go first. They said, fine. In pride, they go down to get dirt, and God goes, oh, get your own dirt. We live in a world of matter. There's a designer. Sun rises and the sun sets. It's so patterned that we can have seasons, winter, spring, summer, fall. We can rotate crops. The intricacy, we say we've evolved from some primordial soup, but yet we see the intricacy of even a single cell, and it's just beyond comprehension. It screams of a designer, but we dismiss that idea. And we want to throw off constraints, and so this idea that humans are evolving, it's science, God's not needed, and that's where we are today. We don't teach morality. We don't teach about God. We don't want God anywhere in the equation. Understood. I grew up with this. I remember prayer in schools. It's gone now. People think, what, prayer in school? I remember bringing my BB gun to school and my Boy Scout pocket knife for show and tell. They're like, oh, that's cool. And you say, oh, this morality, bunch of white slaveholders. They were hypocrites. The founders were hypocrites. Washington and Jefferson were both slaveholders. True, they were slaveholders. False, that they were hypocrites. Prove it. Okay, I will. Let me read this to you. This is written by Jefferson. There must doubtless be an unhappy influence on the manners of our people produced by the existence of slavery among us. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most heinous of passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part and degrading submissions on the other. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are gifts of God, that they are not to be violated by his wrath, but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just. The Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us in such a contest. The spirit of the master is abating, and that of the slave is rising from the dust for a total emancipation, and that this is disposed in order of events to be with the consent of the masters rather than their extirpation. You say, okay. Well, don't forget, where did he come from? He came from, interestingly enough, Virginia. Virginia. In 1787, Virginia looked at their land grant that they were given. And this was the Virginia Charter of 1609, and it went from the coast all the way through Pennsylvania, Maryland, North Carolina, and it was supposed to go all the way to the coast, which they hadn't figured out yet. Virginia was the largest of the colonies as far as land mass. And in 1787, they decided to open up what they called the Northwest Ordinance, where they would allow other states into this union, but they had requirements. And so what they did is the first 6 states to enter into the Northwest Ordinance that were in the Virginia region were Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. Interesting about Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan is that they all fought on the northern side. Why? Well, here's the Northwest Ordinance. Article 3, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Article 6, there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory. You want this territory, you want to make a state, you teach the Bible, and you don't allow slavery. Virginia, what are you doing? Jefferson, why are you putting this forward? And here you see the picture of it. And every one of those states fought for the abolition of slavery. They were founded by the Northwest Ordinance. The founders wanted to do away with slavery, but it's similar to this. If you have a foe coming at you, you've got 13 getting ready to fight a massive army, and you're in disagreement on these things, and some of them are slaveholders because they use another man's labor and they give them nothing. But there are principles that you're in agreement with, but you have a greater enemy coming upon you. They make concessions, and we'll go through this in time with the 3-5 compromise and a number of other things, to fight a larger entity. They conquer that, and then they sit down, and in the Constitution, they did everything they could to remove slavery from the American continent. The Three-Fifths Compromise, the South wanted to count slaves as a population to have greater representation in the legislature, in the House of Representatives. But they didn't want to give their slaves a right to vote. They just wanted to count them as citizens. And so the northern states said, if you're holding slaves, they can be only counted as 3/5 of the population, not to demean them as a human being, but to take away your influence from slavery, so that we can continue to abolish this heinous, miserable institution that is now in the warp and the woof. And here you see this, am I not a man and a brother? And here is the ordinance from the Northwest Ordinance, Article 6, there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory otherwise than in the punishment of crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, provided always that any person escaping into the same from which labor or service is lawfully claimed in any one of the original states, such fugitive may be lawfully reclaimed and conveyed to the person claiming his or her labor or service as foresaid. And so you look at it and you see, yes, they did have slaves. But each person agreed that it was something that needed to be removed from the nation. And again, if we go 243 years from today, will they look back on our generation? We've aborted more babies in California than the entire population of Canada. What's history going to say about you if the morality changes? We're almost finished tonight. I'm going to take you through just a couple other things. I want to read this to you first. I read you that. This is the second treatise of John Locke. And you say, why John Locke? He had an enormous influence on the founders. He was in the 1600s, and he started to write about these concepts of civil liberty. Locke's concept of man started with the belief in creation. And like the philosophers that our founders looked at, Hugo Grotius, Samuel Pufendorf, Locke equated natural law with biblical revelation. Well, why is that significant? Locke's two treatises of government presented a critique of the divine right of kings and outlined the principles of natural rights and government by consent. Written during the 1670s, they were not published until after the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the passage of the English Bill of Rights in 1689. Locke was the political theorist quoted most frequently by Americans in the 1770s. This idea of consent of the governed. You and I are equal. Maybe not in capacity, but certainly in dignity. You're probably smarter, wealthier, better businessman. We're physically different in some capacity, but we're equal. I can't do to you anything you don't give me consent to do. That's America. And thus, as an elected official, I come to you and I say, I want to represent your sovereignty. Will you give me your consent? How do you give me that consent? By voting. I represent you, I'm accountable to you. Does that make sense? That didn't exist before. There was nothing like this on the face of the earth. And you can read the second treatise of government by John Locke, but to understand political power right and derive it from its original, we must consider what state all men are naturally in. This is John Locke writing this. And that is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit within the bounds of the law of nature. This is where they get this idea in the Declaration, laws of nature, nature's God, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. A state also of equality, wherein all the power and jurisdiction of reciprocal, no one having more than another, there being nothing more evident than that creatures of the same species and rank, promiscuously born to all the same advantages of nature, and the use of the same faculties should also be equal amongst others without subordination or subjection, unless the Lord and Master of them all should, by any manifest declaration of his will, set one above another, and confer on him by an evident and clear appointment an undoubted right to dominion and sovereignty. And he goes through this idea, but though this be a state of liberty, yet it is not a state of license. Though man in the state have an uncontrollable liberty to dispose of his person or possessions, yet he has not liberty to destroy himself or so much as any creature in his possession, but where some nobler use than its bare preservation calls. I don't want to read through the whole thing, but I will read this to you. This was written by Marcus Tullius Cicero, 106 to 43 BC. And you're saying, well, this is a Christian principle, and Locke he believed in creation. And okay, let's go to Cicero. This is a Roman. Cicero was a great defender of the Roman Republic and a master of oratory, the author of several books on politics, philosophy, rhetoric. He was the first to speak of natural law as a moral or a political law, and was an important influence on the founder, Cicero. He said, true law is right reason, consonant with nature, spread through all people. It is constant and eternal. It summons to duty by its orders. It deters from crime by its prohibitions. It orders and prohibitions to good people are never given in vain, but it does not move the wicked by these orders or prohibitions. It is wrong to pass laws obviating this law. It is not permitted to abrogate any of it. It cannot be totally repealed. We cannot be released from this law by the Senate or the people. And the idea is, it doesn't matter if you believe in gravity or not, it is a law that governs you. And Cicero's pointing out, these laws of nature govern you. You don't steal. You don't lie. You don't covet. It's not rocket science. But if I lie, I don't want to be judged. And if I can get in power, then my ability to avoid consequences, I like power. I can do as I please. I can take rights from others. I can covet their possessions and take them. Forget about property rights. I'm going to take your land. I'm going to take your paycheck. We just passed a gas tax. What's wrong? The U.S. Constitution is losing its strength in our country because we are no longer a moral people, nor do we see the need for this immovable structure. But I want to share this, and this is what we'll close with tonight. I want to share with you the U.S. Constitution. I call it a work of art. Constitution is where you get this word statute, and statute is a Roman cognate of the word statue. Statue is an immovable work of art. And Aristotle said that there's four causes to a work of art. It's real simple. You can look at these four causes. There's the material cause, that out of which it was made. So for example, a statue is made out of marble. That's the material cause, right? Got it? Wake up. The formal cause. What form does the statue take? What's the shape of it? The efficiency cause, who made it? And then the final cause, why did you make it? And so one of my favorites, actually I'll show you three of them, really famous artists, Michelangelo. This is in Florence, Italy. It's the statue of David, massive structure. David is looking towards Rome, and it's in Florence, and he's looking towards Rome. And he's declaring that the Republic of Florence is to be protected, and if Rome wants to usurp our authority, they can come and take it. He's standing in defiance. We'll take down Goliath. He's holding his sling. His hands are massive. Michelangelo built it to express this. So the material cause is white marble. There it is. The formal cause, it's in the shape of David. The efficiency cause, it was made by Michelangelo. What's the purpose? Why did he do it? To declare the freedom of Florence from Rome. That's why he was enlisted to make it. He also did this one. This one's of Moses, the lawgiver. Totally different, almost like it'll come to life and start walking. This ancient man holding the law. This idea that we are governed by a series of laws. These moral constraints that hold us together. This honoring of this moral knowledge given by our Creator that we would flourish. Here's a Pieta. It's Mary holding Jesus, his lifeless body in her arms. This idea of sacrifice. You can see what the material is. You can see who made it. You can see the shape of what it is. It's Mary and Jesus. And then why? The love of a Savior. All of these things were inspired. Every other human being saw a block of marble. Michelangelo saw that. He was the efficiency cause. He put it together. There's 4 causes for this great work of art we call America. You have the material cause, the efficiency cause, the formal cause, and the final cause. And here's the answer to all of them. The material cause is the land and the people. I'll cover that momentarily. The efficiency cause is the founding fathers. The formal cause, the form it takes, is the Constitution, a special structure of government that it established. And then the final cause is the principles of free government outlined in the Declaration of Independence. The material cause, land and people. Never again in the history of the world will you have an open space that goes from the Atlantic to the Pacific. As a matter of fact, the reason why they called the Army of the United States of America the Continental Army is because they loved the land, the continent. It was there, and they were the army of this continent, the Continental Army. Never before did you have a group of people highly educated and committed to religious liberty. These are the folks that came together, this material cause, the land and the people, began to establish and colonize and set it up. The efficiency cause were the founders. These are folks that were well-read. They had gone through the First Great Awakening. They had gone through a number of insights, and they began to read. They knew Locke. They knew Cicero. They put together these concepts and these ideas. They were men of affluence, and they were folks that understood these things. And they started to put this together, and the formal cause was this Constitution that they put together, 7 articles, all found in their disagreements with the king, that they built this statute, this Constitution, this immovable structure, so that nobody could infringe on these inalienable rights. Where did they get this concept? In the final cause, the principles of free government outlined in the Declaration of Independence. How do we give mankind freedom? We declare by the consent of the governed, we're equal. I can't do anything to you without your consent. And every human being is bound by these articles. And we will divide the power between legislative, executive, and judicial, because if one person holds it, we have a sin nature that Locke would describe. We are accountable to the laws of nature, and nature's God. And so that's why they included all these things, and they understood virtue, because it's this triangle of freedom. And if we remove faith, then we remove virtue. And if we remove virtue, then we remove freedom. They must exist. You like America. You like freedom. Where does yours come from? Who said that you are free? Who said that we've been created equal? Why do I not have the right to rule you? Why do I not have the right to take your money? Why am I not allowed to put a gun and rob all of you? Because there's rules, there's laws. Says who? And you say, well, the difference. If our rights come from God, then we're all accountable. But if our rights come from man, those in power will tell you what you can have and you can't have. Faith. What does that bring? Virtue. What does virtue bring? Freedom. Land of the free, home of the brave. I don't like religion. Sometimes I don't either. What's your point? Well, I just don't think we need God. Well, how are you going to fix everything? People just need to, we just need to kick these illegal aliens out. Says who? The folks in power now disagree with you. So, I'm sorry. Can we turn off the phone? Yeah, just shut it down. Anyone else, just turn it off. Who says? But if you have a constitution that we're bound by, And these powers are enumerated and they're listed. And we educate our people so they're not ignorant. And with that comes faith. And we want to teach them how to read. We want to teach them right and wrong. We want to impart moral knowledge. Granted, I know the church is screwed up. You know why it's screwed up? Because we're trying to adapt to the culture instead of trying to drive the culture. Oh, 3 people, huh? And you know why we don't want to drive the culture? Because when you talk about stuff like this, people write letters about you in the Acorn. What's interesting is, I haven't read the letter, but I know the issue and the concern. And I know the hurt involved, and I actually like the person a lot who wrote it. I do. I wish folks that had convictions scripturally were as active and as passionate as my friend. And I don't fault him for feeling the way he does about me. And he disagrees with my worldview. What he doesn't understand is we're probably a lot closer than he thinks, because we're in a pluralistic society. And in a pluralistic society, you're saying that you're not going to give us a special presentation to acknowledge us a certain month. Well, let me tell you something else. I am vehemently pro-life. I believe it's a baby in the womb. Probably folks here, a lot of them don't agree with me. But guess what? As the mayor of the city, I'm not going to do a special presentation on Sanctity of Life Week. I represent the 167,000 people of the community. My job is to legislate to the best of my ability and navigate these things. And sometimes you succeed and sometimes you fail. But I'm doing it. I'm exercising this Constitution. Most people don't even know what's in it, and I've sworn to defend it. We have people show up at council meetings for one issue. I watched this, over 50 speakers. And then they left. And we passed over a $200 million budget. And you know how many people were in the gallery? None. Nobody was there. You've been given a representative form of government to hold people accountable with the consent you've given them. And you know what you're telling them when you don't participate? Do whatever you want. Give them all free health care. Wait a minute. What are you doing? Well, we're doing what we want to do. Well, says who? You didn't even vote. I'll talk about the church. 15 million evangelicals in California. 7,280,000 of them are not even registered to vote. Of the half that are registered to vote, half of those vote in a presidential election and 12% vote in a non-presidential election. Consent, do whatever you want. Do you know what they're teaching our children in the schools? Doesn't matter. You don't participate. You don't do it. And the idea is, this was a revolutionary document that changed the history of the world and gave consent to the governed back to the people. And apathy is taking it away from us. And how do you get back? Faith, virtue, freedom. Faith, virtue, freedom. You have a better answer? Otherwise, you just go in the Tytler cycle. Because right now we're in apathy and dependency. And soon it's going to be bondage. Oh, I'm going to move. Good, move. You're going to take the problem with you. You're just as apathetic here as you'll be there. It requires people to participate. Accountable to God, accountable to each other. I didn't write this, they did. If you're upset, take it up with them. Was the founding of America revolutionary or conservative? We'll conclude with this. This is a fun one. If I haven't irritated everybody, I will now. Was the founding revolutionary or conservative? Love it. It was both. Typical politician answer. Shut up. The American founding was both revolutionary and conservative. It sought to conserve the oldest and highest law, which according to the Declaration of Independence is the laws of nature and nature's God. So it was conservative. Conserve means a conservative walks up and says, there's a wall here, let's find out why. A revolutionary comes up and take the wall down. The founders compared the natural law to conventional law under which they lived, and as described so eloquently and succinctly in the Declaration of Independence, determined that a revolution was justified in the name of this higher law. They didn't just come to the wall and say, take it down. They said, you're not allowed to imprison people. We're taking the wall down. We have the right and the obligation to throw off the bonds of constraint that are contrary to what God has given us. I don't believe in God. Fine. Give me a chance to enslave you then. Or when will you be enslaving someone else? If we're going to dwell together, we need to be accountable to a creator and to each other. I don't care if tonight you're a Mormon or you're Reformed or conservative or Orthodox Jewish, or that you're Catholic, or that you're Protestant, whether you're Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Methodist, Calvary. I don't care. I don't even care if you're a deist. Do you believe that we are commanded and accountable? Then let's apply this to our culture. Because faith, virtue, freedom. Faith, virtue, freedom. The triangle. It's indispensable. It'll keep us out of the loop. And this experiment in liberty will go on for years to come, for generations yet to be born. And it's worth defending and getting involved. And I close tonight by saying this. If you're discouraged, look at the room tonight. This is remarkable. This is remarkable. And this is taking place in other churches and other communities around the country. And everyone is starting to awaken. I'll leave you with this last thought. In Christendom, we use these terms. We talk about a revival. We talk about an awakening. A revival is, in Scripture, this idea of you're revived because the Bible has touched you and you've been revived. An awakening's different. An awakening happens oftentimes apart from religious participation. Everyone looks around and they go, this is wrong. I haven't been to church in a long time, but I can tell you there shouldn't be this many homeless in LA. Our police officers shouldn't be getting these diseases. There shouldn't be hypodermic needles and fecal matter everywhere. There shouldn't be an influx. There shouldn't be this much taxation and this high of poverty and homelessness. And I've never paid this much in gas tax, and these roads, I got to wear a kidney belt. Something's not working. Guess what? You're awakening. Oh, I don't know if I like that term. Too bad. Because if you're not awakening and you're going, oh, this is the best state to live in, why is everybody moving? Oh, well, there's a certain segment that aren't. The ones that can afford the coast. And they can survive this. They have the wealth. But the middle class is gone and the poor are living in the streets. This is an awakening. And you're part of that. And I take great heart in that because I've lived in this state my entire life. And I want to see it flourish. I want to see it flourish. I want families strong, communities strong. I don't want people dependent on drugs. We have a heroin epidemic in our community. We have members in our congregation, their kids have died. Let's wake up. And credit to all of you. Some of you may be asleep right now because I'm talking so soft, but a credit to all of you. You're waking up. Congratulations. Now let's get busy. Amen means true. Amen? Amen. All right. God bless you guys.